Morning, everybody. Welcome to part one on 1960. 1960 is an incredible year. It's notable for a lot of changes in the industry. Some labels are almost gone at this point. Emercy being one that's pretty much no longer. Mercury's taken over anything that's coming out that's jazz. And they're more focused now on guys like Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones is crossing over the stuff he's doing even in the late 50s, early 60s. Starts becoming much broader than just the hard bop, modern jazz that we're familiar with in this era. But I first want to address something. I had one guy in particular trying to debate with me off of the channel, Facebook Messenger, about how race isn't as much of a factor as I say it is. And I had to eventually just delete the guy because his politics were so pro-white, pro-national, pro-America, pro-Israel, and he openly said he didn't care about the rest of the world. And that's as propagated as a man can be. You are a product of your nation and your media and your control and your fear of Russia and China and everybody else. Those are the enemies of the state. People are people everywhere. And if you don't think that we're meddling and interfering in other people's economics and politics and our selling agenda every time you turn on the news, you're fooling yourself. And if you don't think this music is about race, every step of the way, even the business side of this industry. When I talk about the record labels, one of the most illuminating things about it is how even race was such a factor there. Who they signed, who they played with, how well distributed it was, how well they got paid, where they were able to play. Race infiltrates every aspect of jazz, every aspect of the music business, still to this day. And race is such a predominant thing even now. 70 years ago, it was omnipresent. And that's not to say some of the racial deconstruction isn't driven by the media and by the backers of the media. Of course it is. They don't want us to have unity. They want us to be divided, lacking understanding of each other, because God forbid we ever put aside our differences and recognize our commonalities. If we were to have a unified 90% that recognize, gee, we all kind of want clean water, good health care, good school systems. This is stuff we all want. Black, white, Muslim, Jew, it doesn't matter. We all want those things. And we do. But we're so busy fighting over the stupid minutia that the TV screens pump into our veins every moment of every day that we're too scared to go, well, you know what, I would like to have better schools. We're so focused on the fear that all we ask, all we demand ever is, please keep me safe. Please keep me safe from the Soviets. Please keep me safe from the terrorists. Please keep me safe from the Muslims. Please keep me safe from the Mexicans that are coming. Please keep me safe from the blacks within our own borders. And as the Ouroboros, that serpent that consumes its own tail, speaks on, when the serpent no longer has enemies to feed on, it feeds on its own people. And those military contractors have been one of the most powerful industries on the planet, ran out of enemies to fight. Terror became a ghost in the night. And once we started seeing behind that veil, it's turned on its own people. And we've militarized our police departments to the point where they're armed to the teeth, beyond any possible realms necessary, and the only way they can justify that is to keep the population terrified. If you're so scared that Chicago is a war zone, you'll never say, you know what, we shouldn't militarize the police, we shouldn't give them bigger, better weapons. And there's industries that fuel that fear. They need chaos. You gotta remember that. We have to be focused on every time and go, who is benefiting from this? Protesters don't benefit from looting. Causes don't benefit from terrorism. To suppress a cause, now that benefits from looting. That benefits from rioting. That benefits from terror. When you can attach terrorism to a cause, you can suppress that cause. No one with a real, genuine cause would use a militant means against random human civilians to gain attention for their plight. To do something inhumane so you'll support my humanity Makes no fucking sense. They're not that stupid. No one really looking to garner the support of the United Nations, the world leaders, would blow up a school. But if you want to suppress that group trying to find its individual freedom because they want economics that you don't agree with and you want to keep exploiting their resources, you make them look like a bunch of savages by you blowing up a school and making it look like they did it. I see the Christian churches in Africa doing this all the time so they can garner millions of dollars in donations because a Christian school got bombed in Nigeria. That's bullshit. No one benefits from that except for those who are trying to suppress those enemies. You have to use some common sense. You have to use some... Who benefits? And any detective can tell you that. And for those people who don't think race is a big part of what jazz is and about, and doesn't impact and influence what black and white musicians are telling us, subscribe to a different channel. Watch a different channel, because I am not going to stop talking about it. Race is what creates this music. Race is what fuels the adrenaline that black musicians speak in. It's omnipresent. And white musicians can be as good, if not better. They can sell way more records and be more famous. It's not saying they're better or worse. It's saying they're telling you a different story. A white guy, for all his troubles and sorrows, doesn't sleep at night wondering if tomorrow's my next day on this earth every day. It's not how he lives. He might need to get his junk. He might hate his wife. He might be ready to kill his children. But he's not fearing for his life every moment and every day. The anxiety, the tension, the exhaustion of being black in America wears you down. You hear black basketball athletes like LeBron James talking about it today. How scary it is to be a black male. Imagine being Kenny Dorham. Imagine being Louis Armstrong. Imagine being Lee Morgan. And the coded message that comes through the horns of so many of these players is succinctly speaking on that resistance, that exhaustion, that an end to tyranny must come. And so again, if you don't think race is a part of this, A, you don't know your history very well. B, you don't recognize how art reflects the times more accurately than the times reflects itself. No history, no culture, no empire in history has ever told its citizenry the full story. You get the slant that we need you to believe so you won't interrupt our operations. This is what we need you to think is happening, not what's really fucking happening. And it's so clear to me when you look at the past and how empires turn on their own citizens to try to maintain and squeeze more wealth into their own little greedy pockets, that we're becoming victims of that. We're becoming victims of a serpent that's so starved and its appetite is so voracious that to turn our own people against each other, to create a civil war, it's good for their agenda economically. They don't care. They don't care if we wipe each other out. And I often thought it'd be a fun TV show to make, to show 40 years in the future, a civil war that pits urban versus rural. And literally acts of terror being retributed against each other. Just an immediate maelstrom of lies fumigating and fueling this conflict. And it already feels like there's some of that cinder starting. And I've been talking about this for a while. They want those who have empathy and live in the city and have exposed to diversity to be repugnated by the rural guy who's so prejudiced and small-minded. And they want that rural guy who's in isolation to be so afraid of going to the city, he'll never get that degree of empathy and understanding that living there requires. And so, again, I'm not going to talk race every episode, but if you don't think race is a factor, you're not paying very close attention, or your white privilege has you so wrapped up in ignorance and fear. This guy was talking about how blacks are their own problem and they haven't suffered any insane lunacy what this guy was speaking about. And I was trying to say, well, maybe we're just looking at it through one point of view. And he said he was offended by what I had to say. Well, brother, let me tell you something. I've been talking this stuff for decades. The only people who ever get offended by me are small-minded white nationalists, so wrapped up in a flag and indoctrinated in propaganda that they can't even think straight. Shame on you. I don't need people like you in my life. You cause me agita just having to try to combat your ignorance, your foolishness. Done with you. That being said, 1960, let's move on. So 60 is a great year. The changes that have been propelling into the late 50s are now going to show in full bore here in 1960. We're going to see the end of labels like Emerson. Bethlehem's pretty much a shell of its former self. It's just a few titles that King is reissuing that they issued on other of their labels earlier on the repackaging for Bethlehem. Savoy is doing a trickling of records. They're about to transition over into gospel and soul, black gospel music. They're going to go very much away from jazz. A few small labels show up on the scene that make a pretty big impact. VJ has a big impact in 1960. Time Records out of New York has a big impact in 1960. Candid shows up and has some pretty impressive titles. And then, of course, Impulse is launched in the fall of 1960 for the holiday season. And they don't really come into full swing into 61, but Impulse's arrival is, of course, noteworthy. So we're going to see a lot of changes here. Today we're going to start with Blue Note and Riverside. And what Blue Note does in 1960 here, I'm going to show you a dozen titles. They run from about 40-30 to about 40-60. 30 titles right there. 40-31, The Great Soul Station. Truly one of the great records on the Blue Note discography is Hank Mobley's Soul Station. It's got Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, Art Farmer. Art Blakey, sorry, not Art Farmer. It's just a wonderful proto soul jazz record. It's not soul jazz. It still has a hard driving, hard bop-ish mentality, but it's not as hard boppish as his earlier sides were. It's got a bit more soul to it, a bit more melody, a little bit more melancholy even. You're starting to see Hank age and refine his sound and tone to becoming the sweet tone player that we all love and know. I love his efforts in 1960-61, Roll Call. It's all workout. It's all fantastic stuff. He's about to go work with Miles Davis for a year, and that wasn't a very positive experience for him. I think Miles didn't really care for having another guy on stage that emoted from a similar tone. Coltrane and Shorter don't sound like Miles in any way. Despite it being on different horns, Mobley has a softer center, a more sensitive emoting, more melodic and minimal. And I think Miles didn't really care for that synonymous style. He wanted someone that was going to contrast his minimalism. And I think in some ways hurt Mobley's career and hurt Mobley's confidence. And Mobley ends up being homeless and broke by the time the 1970s come around. And I think he has a small resurgence before he passes, but it's a sad story of one of the true jazz giants who doesn't get the recognition at the time he's alive at all. And of course now his records have become the most collectible records in the Blue Note discography. Any Hank Mobley record from the 1500 series up into the 4200 series, those records will all fetch upwards of $1,000, sometimes $4,000 or $5,000 for really mint copies of certain titles. He's a giant of a man in a spiritual, conscious sense, not in a physical sense. There's like one little bit of footage of him speaking. He just isn't documented very well. He really slipped under the radar in his lifetime. Soul Station is a great place for anybody to start their Blue Note catalog. You know, it's always been in print for the most part nowadays, whether it's a cheaper label. I don't care. Buy a cheap label. I'd rather people have the music for $15 than not have it for $2,000. And a $15 record that comes from a CD is still 1,000 times better than streaming it. All these vinyl snobs putting down these digital source music labels out of Europe, I don't understand them. You just sound like you're bitter that somebody else got a record you paid hundreds of dollars for $12. Not everybody's sitting around talking about their hi-fi speakers and their listen to how quiet it is. You can't even hear it. Well, what's the point of that? You know, I'd rather people have the music, enjoy it on the vinyl where it's supposed to be heard from, soak it in and get to know, have a relationship with it, which a vinyl record allows you to do. You don't connect with things when you stream them. You don't get to feel them and tactilely understand them and get to know who was on the sidemen. It's a different experience on the vinyl. And I'm going to guess 90% of the audiophile snobberies, if they were blindfolded and were given some cheap budget label and some older label, 90% of the time they'd be wrong which one was which. Especially if you put them outside of their own comfort zone, outside of their own living room. So anyway, that's 4031. And again, it's a 5-star classic by anyone's definition. Jackie McLean, Capuchin Swing. Of course, a reference to the little monkey there, a Capuchin monkey. This is McLean now kind of in full swing at Blue Note. And I think his Blue Note 60s material is his greatest stuff. His prestige stuff sounds looser, less defined, less refined. He's kind of still finding his voice, shaking the cobwebs of bebop off. By the time he comes to Blue Note in 59, 60, 61, into the mid-60s, he's making some of the most poignant, powerful, modern jazz records with edges of the avant-garde. Of course, on some later records, 63, 64, he starts diving much deeper into those sounds than he is here. But this is with Walter Bishop, Paul Chambers, and Art Taylor. Fantastic session, not to be slept on. Tina Brooks makes his first record here. I have done a little episode on him probably 3 months ago. If you want to search that in the library, you can look it up. Fantastic sax player, a troubled guy, had a bad drug problem. He makes this record. It comes out simultaneously with another big album. I can't remember what it was. Something else comes out simultaneously with this, and it kills the sales of this. It never really sold well. And so that means the next 2 tracks, the 2 sessions that Tina Brooks recorded, Blue Note didn't issue them. And they've since come out. Tone Poet reissued, I can't think of the name right now. I have it, it's great. And they also reissued Back on the Tracks, which was even given a scheduled number release but didn't come out. That came out first in Japan, and then it's been issued here in America for a while. But Tina Brooks is a great player, firmly in the hard bop tradition, a strong emotive sense. Here he's playing with the great piano player Duke Jordan, with Sam Jones, Art Taylor, and of course Freddie Hubbard. And if I recall, it might have been Freddie Hubbard who had a record come out simultaneously that really killed his sales, and I can't recall. Horoscope, Horace Silver, 4042. This is another great Horace Silver session. I'm pretty much a fan of all Horace Silver's early Blue Note material. It's very accessible jazz that pretty much any collector can get into. You know, you can play Horace Silver and people won't leave the room. But yet he's still a great composer. He has a great group with him at this time. Lou Mitchell's in the crew, Junior Cook's in the crew, Roy Brooks and Gene Taylor round out the rhythm section. And I've said many times, Horace Silver is one of the true architects of the Blue Note sound. Art Blakey's the more propelled, more aggressive sound of Blue Note, and Horace Silver is a bit more the mid-tempo, while still hard driving. It's always got melodic center to it and has a great pulse. He's very cognizant of groove. I think Count Basie was someone he really recognized how minimal Basie was at times. And truly, Horoscope, all his early Blue Note stuff is of note and should be collected. The aforementioned Duke Jordan has this great record here, number 4046. And Duke Jordan is truly one of the unheralded guys. He goes to Europe for quite a long time, which always kind of limits their exposure here in America. Americans don't care too much for things happening overseas. This has the great UK player Dizzy Reese on it. Stanley Turrentine plays some fiery tenor on this. Art Taylor and Reggie Workman round out the rhythm section. It's not a record you see as often as some Blue Notes, but Flake to Jordan is a great session, and Blue Note really doesn't make bad records. 4048, Donald Byrd, he's still making a string of incredible records, going back to 5960 when he comes over to Blue Note. He just makes record after record that are just some of the greatest gospel blues infused hard bop sessions. There's always a spirituality and a Black Baptist church sense to it. He seems to have a real feel for the gospel in his blues, but he's also got a certain amount of aggression, and he's been impacted by the Sonny Clarks and the Lee Morgans and the whole Blue Note stable of young black youth. That's an important aspect to recognize, is that the black stable was young black youth from their 20s into their 40s and 50s. And there's a lot of maturity, there's some leadership, there's some aggression, there's some resistance. The entire scope of the black political spectrum would have existed within that Blue Note stable. And Byrd never seems to be as militant as some, but he certainly seems as fed up as any. And his path to change seems to be a little bit more positive than some of the guys. And I'm a huge fan of his work. This is 4048. The great Duke Pearson's on the piano on this. Hank Mobley, Jackie McLean, Doug Watkins, Reggie Workman, and Lex Humphreys. I think it's interesting you have Mobley and Jackie on this. Mobley's going to be that creamier tenor, and Jackie's going to be that more aggressive, brittle alto. And that gives some real edge to the group parts when they're playing the passages together. You have the bright Byrd, the brittle McLean, and the smooth, creamy Mobley. It's high-level stuff. Great Reed Miles cover. Art Blakey, of course, is firmly now in a string of Blue Note royalty records. This is Night in Tunisia. He has a number of great records, 59, 60, 61. The group is kind of consistently shifting and changing. Guys coming and going. But Shorter's in this, Lee Morgan's in this, Bobby Timmons, Jamie Merritt, and Blakey. This is the second time he records and calls a record Night in Tunisia, which is interesting. The first one being, of course, for Vic, with a much different lineup. But Shorter, his arrangements are always really cutting edge and the utmost in modernity. And he doesn't do the soft shades, and he doesn't have the pastel palette that he gets with Miles at times. With Blakey, it's much more brights, full colors, full blues, full reds, full greens, full oranges. There's none of those shadings, and it's very much full in your face composition. Morgan, of course, met Shorter at VJ and brings him over to Blue Note, and again, you can't really say enough about the importance of Art Blakey and the stable of musicians that he kind of schools, and all the guys that work with him in that group. It's true royalty. For my money, Jimmy Smith, 5960, it's the pinnacle of his career. Home Cookin', this is fantastic, number 4050. His early 1500 stuff is very much based and rooted in the trio setting. And it's usually just him, a drummer, and a guitar player, and they're just kind of letting him fill all the space. And his incredible virtuosity was the show. Most of those 1500 titles are going to be like that. They're going to be live recordings of just Jimmy tearing the organ apart at the seams. And of course, in 60, he gets signed away to Verve. And so by 61, he's over there recording another long string of records. A lot of them have Oliver Nelson arrangements, which changes the sound and the production value. His verse stuff is very different. But by the time he's at Blue Note 5960, towards the end of his run at Blue Note, he makes a string of records that are outstanding. Back at the Chicken Shack, The Sermon, Home Cookin', House Party. Those four records are Jimmy Smith at his best. In part because they're bigger ensembles, which allows Smith to be more of the pocket player. He's going to lay down those thick hammers and just make a pathway for all the great horn players to shine on. And they're much more cohesive and much less just one man's ego speaking. Kenny Burrell's on this, Donald Bailey's on the drums, Percy Francis on the tenor sax, and Jimmy Smith. And if you're going to get Jimmy Smith records, start with one of those four. Sermon, Home Cookin', Chicken Shack, House Party. Those four records are all outstanding, hard bop, with some very incredible bebop virtuosity mingled in. Number 4056 is, of course, my favorite trumpet player. At this point, I'm willing to say it. Clifford Brown's always going to be number one, but Clifford Brown's career is cut so short. And Hubbard's fire, vivacity, his melodic sensibility, his clinging to the blues, him centering sessions that were kind of going out. If you have Hubbard on that session, he's always going to draw it back in. And I love guys like that. Another great cover, Philly Joe, Paul Chambers, McCoy Tyner, and Hank Mobley. Again, fantastic 1960, great album cover going up. I'm just a huge fan of Freddie Hubbard. Anybody who's listened to me for any time knows how big a Freddie Hubbard fan I am. Nobody in this music has the ability to play such long, fluid lines in the trumpet without tailing off towards the end of his line. You know, only Clifford Brown can match it. He's just got this full, long, breathy lung capacity that allows him to do these incredible things that non-trumpet players I don't think can appreciate. And I am not a trumpet player, but I do know how difficult an instrument it is to play. I dabbled on it a little bit back in high school, back when schools used to have music programs. What a great loss that was for society when they stripped music from our school systems. Not giving kids that outlet for expression, for self-discovery. We wonder why our suicide and depression levels are where they are. We treat people like shit. We don't want you to be informed. We want you to have your face locked into a screen all day long so we can indoctrinate how you think and teach you how to consume. That's all you're here to do. Get back to work, worker ant. And we ain't worker ants. When we live a life, this is a vibrato. When we live a life that resembles a worker ant, we are depressed monkeys. We are meant to be staring at the moon, lighting a fire, scratching our head and going, I wonder. Purpose, meaning, what's driving this? And when we stop questioning that and just become consumers, just become working on the anthill, of course you're unhappy. Of course. Blue Hour, Sally Turrentine. I covered this in a throat grabber recently. Willow Weep for Me is absolutely gorgeous. The whole record is gorgeous. It's Turrentine with the great three sounds, and it's one of the great bluesy sessions of 1960 at Blue Note, and they really do a great job playing a very, very melodically centered version of Blue Note sound. Roll Call is another, for me, landmark Mobley session, and this, to me, is very different from Soul Station, and it's also very different from Workout. And this one is driven by Art Blakey and Freddie Hubbard. And you change out Philly Joe Jones for Art Blakey, and you change out a Grant Green on Workout for a Freddie Hubbard, you're going to change how that record sounds. It's also going to change how Hank Mobley plays. And Mobley, like I said, is one of the great chameleons. He can really adapt his sound and his tone according to who he's playing with. And when Blakey's laying down that thunder, and Paul Chambers is throwing down that bass, and Wynton Kelly's giving you that groove in that pocket, it's of course going to be a wonderful session. And this is one of Mobley's brightest, most fierce records. You know, it's very different from Soul Station earlier in '60. Soul Station's smooth, mellow, bluesy, beginnings of hints of soul jazz even. This record has edge. And you bring in a Hubbard and a Blakey, you're going to have some edge. And some players would play their thing no matter what. Not a Hank Mobley. And then, to me, one of the greatest records of 1960, not just that Blue Note, but across the whole soundscape, is Undercurrent. See how that piano? It's almost sounding like an undercurrent. Mobley, Hubbard, Sam Jones, and Louis Hayes. Truly one of the great Blue Note records of this time frame. Drew was a very underappreciated player. He's, again, another guy that goes to Europe to find some real freedom. The only thing that's sad about the guys that went to Europe is how much ground they lost here in America in terms of sales and exposure. It really kills them domestically. But they went there and found a happiness and a joy and a calming soothing. And it's reflected in all the sessions they record over there. Nothing recorded in Paris or Copenhagen has the same degree of edge that you get from recordings made in New York. You know, America's a tinderbox, and there's going to be an exhaustion from living on the brink that's going to be reflected in those recordings. Stuff that's recorded in Europe always has a bit more calm, serenity to it. Even if it's full of fire and full of great up-tempo numbers, it still seems to be... And the only reason black guys ever came home from Europe was because they usually would often miss the black community. And while there was a lot of black musicians in Europe, it's not the same as being in touch and communicado with your black neighborhoods, black ghettos, chocolate cities here in America. And so a lot of them quoted that as the reason why they would come home, just to be back around their community and to have some connection with what the experience still was. Moving to Riverside. Riverside is in full bloom. 58, 59, 60. And they just continue it here. Picking a dozen records here for Riverside, and I've actually expanded this episode to over 70 albums. I just thought I couldn't take out some titles. And I was doing 54 for the last 3 years. I started with 36 for the first couple. Now we're over 70. And I think it's necessary to tell the story of 1960. The Thumper, Jimmy Heath, part of the great Heath family in jazz, with Nat Adderley, Curtis Fuller, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, and Albert Heath. And as you see, Fuller has recorded the Blue Note, Wynton Kelly has recorded the Blue Note, Paul Chambers has recorded the Blue Note. They've all recorded the Prestige as well. These guys kind of move and shift between those labels. And if you're a sideman, you can pretty much show up for work at labels and record for any of them. Leadership titles was different, but if you're a sideman, Paul Chambers can record anywhere, and does. He records everywhere. This is one of my favorite Jimmy Heath sessions, in part because Nat Adderley's on this, and Nat is a very bright, fiery, toned, aggressive player. Cannonball is much more smooth and kind of calm. Nat, his brother, is very aggressive in how he emotes. Of course, Curtis Fuller is in a string of making very predominant recordings. He makes his Blue Note stuff 57, 58, 59. He's all over the place with United Artists. And Savoy, he makes a lot of records. He's working with the Jazz Tet with Art Farmer and Benny Golson. And now here in 60, he's all over again. Here he's at Riverside. Great session, a lot of fire. Julian Priester, by the way, 1960, he's going to run about 314 to around 360, if I recall, 340. So it's about 40, 50 records that they put out in this period. This is Julian Priester, who's a trombone player. He's a kind of a young kid at this point. And Priester is going to go on to becoming a fairly big part of the avant-garde movement. He ends up playing with guys like John Gilmore and Sun Ra, and doing some pretty edgy, out there stuff. But he's still kind of a young cat here, finding his way. Tommy Flanagan centers this session on the piano with Sam Jones and Alvin Jones, who aren't brothers. You can see again in this cat's face some of his personality. He's got a little bit of a coy, you can fuck with me no more, man. You know, and he definitely seems to go that path with his music. He's very much a resistance guy. Number 317, another great Art Blakey protege, if you will, is the great Bobby Timmons. And Timmons is probably the second most important pianist in the Messengers behind Horace Silver, and he really is a great rock behind a lot of what the Messengers do in the early to mid 60s. But he starts making solo records here for Riverside. Of course, this here, That Dare, which of course the great Oscar Brown sings an incredible version of that, which I'm going to show you later here in this year. But this is with Sam Jones, Jimmy Cobb, and just a trio. And you can feel the tactile, hard-driving swing of a Bobby Timmons. Just a great record. He's, of course, the composer of That Dare, This Here, and Moanin'. And Moanin's one of the great songs of the 60s. The Blakey record kind of makes it famous, but everybody starts singing it. You know, from Oscar Brown to Mel Torme, people are singing those songs. So he was actually a very important composer. Timmons doesn't probably get enough credit. He makes a string of great records at Riverside, probably 8 to 10 of them, and they're all outstanding. And he definitely is a great album cover. He definitely deserves more credit than he currently gets. Wes Montgomery is now firmly at Riverside, and for me, his Riverside titles are his best. His Verve stuff, he's a real victim of needing to pay his bills, you know. And the Creed Taylor Verve era stuff, whether it's Jimmy Smith, whether it's Wes Montgomery, he really reshapes the jazz that these guys get to make. And only Bill Evans seems to kind of have enough personal power to resist what Verve wants them to do. Evans seems to still be making Bill Evans records. Jimmy Smith, Wes Montgomery, Cal Tjader, Kai Winding, they all start making these kind of well-produced stepping stones to what CTI was going to become. What CTI was in the 70s with that polished production, big arrangements, a bit of a pop commercial sensibility. Verve, once Creed Taylor comes over, starts to really be that as well, as I've explained before. But this is before that. Wes is at his best here with Tommy Flanagan, Percy Heath, and Albert Heath. Great stuff. And every guitar player friend I have says he's the greatest guitar player in jazz. And again, I dabble in the guitar, not enough to recognize the ingenuity of his bending and his chords and his phrasing, like some really good guitar players do. Matt Adderley here doing Bobby Timmons' work song, and again, Oscar Brown does a great version of work song, which I want to show you. But Nat, we talked about just a minute ago. He's such an aggressive, full of fire, unapologetic. You know, you really get a feel from Nat Adderley, like it's all business all the time. And what his personality was like outside of the recording studio, I can't speak to it. But when he's playing, it seems like it's always dire. This is serious, and he has a real strict tonality and aggression to what he says. Wes Montgomery's actually on this with Bobby Timmons, Percy Heath, and Sam Jones. He has a couple records at Savoy, a couple records at Emersy. Him and his brother kind of go together from Savoy to Emersy to Riverside. And for me, Nat Adderley's best records are his early Riverside stuff, 59, 60. He makes some incredible records in that period. This is one of them too, Work Song. This record's called Work Song. and it's probably one of his most expensive titles to get. Worth finding if you can. His brother is making some incredible records as well. This is Them Dirty Blues, Cannonball Adderley Quintet. I think his brother's on this, indeed, with Bobby Timmons. Barry Harris plays on a couple tracks. Sam Jones and Louis Hayes recorded some in New York and some in Chicago. Of course, the Adderleys are from the Tampa, Florida area, which is not a very normal place for jazz cats to come from. But Cannonball on Riverside, just like his brother, it's some of his best work. And Cannonball goes to Capitol after his Riverside years, and he makes some stuff there that's a little bit more commercial, although it still cooks. But he definitely is impacted by the label you record at. And to be honest, as far as I can see from the Capitol records, the greatest, that's that there right there again, the Bobby Timmons track. The greatest records Capitol seems to make might be Cannonball or Adderley's early stuff from the mid-60s. It's pretty good jazz for a record label that doesn't do a lot of black music. I love all his Riverside stuff. A little bit of tape on the jacket. Work Song and Dat Dare are both featured on this as well. And I love Mel Torme's version of Dat Dare. It's really fun. And of course, the Oscar Brown version, the version. Monk has been holding down Riverside since 1955. He's a very integral part of the Riverside story, and the success of Riverside is very interwoven with Monk's presence. You know, Monk makes Riverside the icon that it is, and I think for most fans, you come to Riverside through Monk and Bill Evans. And Bill Evans comes to people through Miles Davis, and Miles, of course, was on Columbia, and Monk was on Columbia, and so those records had big reach, and so Riverside, for most people, we associate it with Monk and Bill Evans. And they're probably the most collectible records on Riverside. Both Monk and Evans records could go for thousands of dollars in the right condition, the right title. This is at the Blackhawk with Charlie Rouse, the great Harold Land, Joe Gordon, the great trumpet players on this, John Orr and Billy Higgins round out the rhythm section. When we hear Monk in a bigger group setting, it's more of a minimal approach from Monk. You're not going to get all the angles and interesting long dissections of melody that he does when he's in a solo or trio setting. But he's with a couple guys that are very sympathetic to the sound. Rouse, of course, was the great simpatico for him. Gordon and Land are both landmark players. Both don't get enough credit. Harold Land, of course, played with Clifford Brown, and Joe Gordon is fresh off his Blackhawk sessions with Shelly Manne. Gordon deserved more titles. He does put out a couple records on Contemporary in this era, but what a great group. Recorded in the Blackhawk, which if I recall is in San Francisco. Great record. Belongs in any jazz collection. Royalty. Number 325 is Yusef Lateef, The Three Faces Of. And he's playing oboe on some of this. He's playing the flute on some of this. He's playing the tenor saxophone on some of this. He's playing with Hugh Lawson on the piano, Herman Wright on the bass. Ron Carter shows up on the cello, and Lex Humphreys is on the drums. Yusef is, of course, a Detroit native. One of the true bringers of world sound into jazz. He incorporates a lot of interesting instruments. He plays a lot of different things. He's a very interesting player. He had just made a long string of records over at Savoy in 57, 58. He does some recordings for Prestige. And then in 60, he makes a couple of records for Riverside that are both really solid outings. Worth finding. Cannonball Adderley presents. Everything in that series is great. This is Riverside, the sound of Wide Open Spaces with James Clay and David Fathead Newman. Of course, Newman is one of the great Texas tenormen. Plays with a lot of R&B and soul. And James Clay is one of the great unheralded guys in that sound. This is a great record. It's very tough to come by nowadays and fetches pretty good money when you do find it. Worth finding. Number 336 is a great record by Blue Mitchell, who of course is working with Horace Silver at Blue Note. But he's getting his own string of records under his own name at Riverside at this point. And he makes about 8 or 9 titles at Riverside that are all outstanding. And then he actually goes to Blue Note and makes about 8 or 9 titles there that are outstanding. And I love every one of those sessions with Wynton Kelly, Sam Jones, and Roy Brooks. Another great Blue Mitchell record that's definitely worth finding. Number 336. Johnny Griffin. His days at Blue Note are now done. He's now at Riverside himself. And he's making some great records with Lockjaw Davis that are kind of these, I wouldn't even call them battle records. They're two very different players. You know, Lockjaw is the storyteller, the blues-based, more slow melodic storytelling. And Griffin was the fiery bebop. I can play 100 notes, but play them all melodically. Wonderful, wonderful sessions. And he makes a lot of records without Lockjaw here at Riverside. The Lockjaw stuff with Griffin is usually at Prestige. Some of it ends up being on Jazzland, though, as well. It's just a great string of records that Griffin and Lockjaw do. And the stuff Griffin does without him is also of note. Griffin's, of course, a Chicago-based guy with Norman Simmons, who has a great record on Argo that's a tough record to come by. Dave Burns plays the trumpet here, another Chicago guy. Victor Sproles, who I also think is from the Chicago Midwest. And then Ben Riley. If Victor Sproles is not from the Midwest, someone will correct me, I'm sure. But Jazz Party, anything Griffin does on Riverside is of note. And so you see both Blue Note and Riverside have this incredible string of records. And I'm only showing you about half of what these guys did, what these labels put out. But it's royalty across the board. I could have showed you the other titles that these labels did at this point, and they're still claiming classics. You know, it's just a great stretch for both Riverside and Blue Note. And we're going to see next episode with Prestige that they are definitely doing some incredible stuff as well. This is Stratus Funk George Russell Sextet. It's the last record I'm going to show you in this episode, number 341. And as you can see, Riverside's embracing Russell with his compositionally driven hints of the avant-garde. Russell can be very complex with his pastels and his colors, and he's a real link for me between Ellington and the Minguses. You know, guys who want to have soundscapes at times, but still have the blues shine through and improvisation be an important part of it. This is with Dave Baker on the trombone, Al Kiger on trumpet, Dave Young on the tenor, George Russell on the piano, Chuck Israel's on the bass, Joe Hunter's on the drums. So it's kind of an anonymous band that's behind him that are willing to sit back and play this man's complex arrangements. Great stuff. George Russell's Riversides, to me, are some of the most unheralded records in the Riverside canon, and his stuff's starting to become recognized because A, it's very rare, and so it's become very expensive. And for the average collector, it certainly seems like, oh, this record goes for $200-300, it's got to be great. And there's not always a relationship there. Sometimes just being rare, being scarce. Sometimes just sellers not knowing, you know. But anyway, Russell's a very important figure. Of course, he's the guy who brings modality into jazz and dissects some of those numbers and the stuff that Miles gets credit for. George Russell should be getting that recognition. So anyway, that's part 1, 1960. Stay tuned for the next episode where we dive into Prestige. We show you the first foray salvo from Impulse, and we're going to look at a few things for Bethlehem, Savoy, and a few other small labels. And then part 3, we got a lot of great stuff as well. So y'all stay tuned and be safe. Peace.